Hi, everybody. For today, you're going to be reading a story by Perkins Gilman, who is widely considered a pioneer in feminist literature, especially in connection to the genre of the short story. Now, the story that we're reading is one of her most famous stories. In fact, it is her most famous story called The Yellow Wallpaper. Now, The Yellow Wallpaper is a story about a woman who lives in a house and whose mental integrity starts to change over the course of the story. And a lot of this, somewhat unexpectedly, is presented through her relationship to the wallpaper in her home. So, a somewhat bizarre approach to thinking about uh, gender, about mental health, mental well being, psychiatry, the politics of medicine. And so I want you to read this story with two specific things in mind. First and foremost, you should know that this is considered by many people one of the best feminist short stories ever written. So think about the gender dynamics. And by that I mean think about how the central character in the story it relates to the men that are named in the story. There aren't very many characters in the story as a whole. There are only about like five total characters. Some of them are men, some of them are women. And so think about the central character's relationship to them along the lines of gender and sex identity. Secondarily, I also want you to think specifically about the built environment. Where is she? What kind of space is this? How is the space described? And more specifically, I want you to consider how the external landscape interacts with her internal landscape. Because this is a story about the experience of women under patriarchy, but it takes a very mentalistic approach, or let's say a psychic approach, where psychic, I don't mean somebody who like reads the cards or like tells you your future. I mean, it's a psychological story. It tries to give you an insight into the psychological dynamics of her mind, really, of how she thinks and how her experience of the world changes by virtue of the things that happen to her. Now, this story, I think this is important to say, was based on Charlotte Perkins Gilman's own lived experience. So think about what exactly is wrong with the central character. There's been a lot written about what name we use for whatever is happening to her. Is it a mental illness? Is it a break in personality? Is it a case of depersonalization? What sort of collapse is happening here? And how would you describe what brought it about? So, what causes the predicament that the female protagonist is facing? And what I mean when I say that this is based on her lived experience, I mean literally she's writing about something that happened to her. So much so that at one point in the story, there is a doctor that is named in the story in a kind of critical fashion. And that doctor that is named in the story was the author's real life doctor. It was her physician. And so she's sort of calling out the medical establishment for its understanding of women's well-being and women's psychology, by building like her own experience with psychiatry into the flow of this fictional narrative. Now, as an author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a major defender of women's rights and equality. Obviously, you see that in this story with her approach to thinking about women's interiority. But she also wrote, I mean, this story is from 1892, so at the very end of the 19th century. And then right after that, she wrote also a book called Women in Economics, which is a book about economics. It's not fiction, where she made a really pioneering argument for her time, which was that a lot of the work that women do in the domestic sphere, like literally like changing diapers, cleaning floors, doing the dishes, that all of that from an economic perspective should be considered work, because it is effortful activity. That's our definition of work. It's something that takes labor, something that you put energy into. It causes you to be tired, and so it's an expenditure of subjective energy. But also it's work in the sense that it contributes to the production and reproduction of social value. And so she made this argument in 1898 that women who are stay at home wives and mothers need to be paid for their domestic work, for their labor. That includes child rearing, that includes the material and like all forms of support they do for the family, as well as like cleaning and all the other domestic tasks that go into keeping at home. So she wrote fiction, sort of representing women's experience. She wrote non-fictional works of social criticism, like this book about women, labor, and economics. But then she also wrote a book in 1915 called Her Land, which is a feminist utopian fiction. So it's a world in which women reproduce asexually without the need for men. And so it tries to depict what a male-less society would look like and whether it would be more just, more fair, more egalitarian than a society with both sexes mixed in. Um, Now, in terms of her her life more broadly, I want to just conclude by mentioning that she passed away, unfortunately, by she died by suicide, and that's because she was diagnosed with a terminal form of breast cancer. And when that happened, Gilman decided to end her life on her own terms. And so she also became a defender of the right to euthanasia or to a dignified death on one's own terms. And I think there is a way of connecting all of these themes through the concept of women's autonomy. I think what she was looking for was for women to have more self determination, to have more agency relative to their own lives, and for her, that also included more agency relative to their own death, as in her own case. She also lived her life somewhat controversially in terms of her interpersonal dynamics. In the late 19th century, to get divorced was a huge deal. It was a major controversy, but she divorced her husband because she was unhappy with the distribution of gender roles in that relationship. And so she became sort of like a divorced single mother who became an author and was writing about what it means to be a woman. Later, she remarried another man and became convinced that that had been the right decision because she ultimately um, it ultimately led her to a more egalitarian romantic relationship where labor, emotional work, all of that were more fairly distributed. And so, in her personal life, in her fiction, in her nonfiction, and even at the moment of death, she really sought to live her life on her own terms. And you see that impulse already in the story, The Yellow Wallpaper.